She just stopped to help a soldier in the rain. A month later, people in uniform knocked on her door, and what they said changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The morning light bled slowly through the thin, mismatched curtains of the small rented home on West Elm Street, filtering in like hesitation. Rachel Thompson stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold linoleum floor, stirring watery oatmeal in a dented pot. The ceiling above the stove was stained from an old leak that had never been fully patched, and the heater in the hallway coughed now and then, struggling to keep up against the late autumn chill. She glanced at the clock on the microwave, 5:42 a.m. already behind. In the next room, her 10-year-old son, Jalen, was pulling on his jacket, the sleeves still too long despite being second-hand. He was quiet this morning, not unusual for a school day, but Rachel noticed the slight hesitation in his movements, the extra second he took to zip his coat, the way he avoided looking her in the eye. "Your oatmeal's almost ready," she said, trying to keep her voice light. He nodded, dropping his backpack near the door and sitting at the table without a word. She set a chipped bowl in front of him, slid the sugar jar closer, and sat across from him with her own mug of instant coffee. Neither of them said much. They rarely did in the mornings. Rachel watched her son, noticed how the knees of his pants were starting to fray and how the laces on his sneakers were different lengths. She knew every threadbare patch in their lives. She wore them like armor, visible to no one but herself. After Jalen left for school, she changed into her cleaning uniform and hurried to her first job, a part-time gig at a neighborhood grocery store, sweeping floors and scrubbing public restrooms before customers arrived. The manager barely acknowledged her as she passed by. It didn't bother her. She had learned long ago that silence was easier than pretending. By noon, she clocked out, changed shirts in the cramped bathroom, and caught the bus to the diner on 14th, where she worked the night shift as a server, usually until 2 a.m. if she was lucky, later if someone called out. Most nights, she walked the 3 miles home when the buses stopped running. She was always exhausted, but always moving. It was the only way to stay ahead of the darkness trying to catch her. Her life was a balance of too many small worries, bills that didn't wait, medicine she skipped, food she stretched. She had long since stopped fantasizing about vacations or new clothes. Her world had narrowed to enough. Enough heat to sleep, enough food to feed Jalen, enough energy to make it to the next paycheck. Then, on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, Rachel found a thick envelope wedged into the frame of her front door. The seal of the family court of Richmond County was stamped on the corner in harsh black ink. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Her ex-husband, Marcus Thompson, had filed a motion for full custody of Jalen. She sat down at the kitchen table, the document spread in front of her like a threat. The legal jargon blurred, but the message was clear. He claimed she was financially unstable, emotionally compromised, and unfit to provide a suitable environment for the minor child. Marcus had never cared about custody before. He hadn't paid child support in 3 years, hadn't attended Jalen's school events, hadn't even called on his birthday last spring. But now he had a new job, a new girlfriend, and apparently a new ambition, reclaiming what he had once thrown away. Rachel stared at the paper until the letters lost shape. She felt the familiar rise of helplessness clawing at her ribs, the tightening in her chest that came when the world reminded her that it could take anything it wanted, no matter how hard she worked to keep it. The court date was in 4 weeks. She had no lawyer, no savings, no family to lean on, Just herself, her son, and a house that technically wasn't even hers. That night at the diner, she worked in a fog. The customers blurred into one another, orders took longer to write down, and more than once, she had to apologize for forgetting drinks or sides. Her manager gave her a look when she spilled a cup of coffee. She knew that look. One more mistake, and she could lose this job too. She walked home that night through a cold drizzle, holding her coat closed with one hand, her phone in the other, scrolling through the free legal aid sites that hadn't updated their numbers in years. Her shoes were soaked, her toes numb by the time she reached her porch. Her knees ached from walking, her back from standing, her heart from everything. She barely slept. When she did, it was with one ear open, one eye on the ceiling, wondering how she would survive the coming weeks. The next day, she pawned her mother's earrings. Small, gold, worn smooth with time. They were the last piece of her mother she hadn't already sold. It bought her groceries and paid half the rent. The landlord called twice about the rest. She let it go to voicemail. Jalen noticed the stress, though he didn't say it out loud. He hugged her more, lingered before bed, and once even asked if he could stay home from school just to be with her. She smiled and said no, but it nearly broke her. Each day bled into the next. At the diner, a regular customer left a $10 tip, and she nearly cried. At the grocery store, a coworker offered to cover her shift. She declined because she needed the money. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been raining hard all evening, a cold, steady downpour that turned the streets into shining rivers and soaked through every coat and shoe within minutes. Rachel's shift ended late, and her manager didn't offer her a ride. She didn't ask. She drove her aging Ford Taurus carefully, the wipers struggling to keep up, headlights slicing through sheets of water. The heater barely worked. She was thinking about Jalen's field trip, the court date, and how she might stretch their groceries another week, when she saw him. A figure, hunched over, walking along the side of the road, drenched, limping, barely visible in the downpour. He wore a military-style jacket that clung to him like a second skin, and a large pack was slung over one shoulder, sagging. She passed him before her brain caught up with her eyes. Every instinct screamed to keep driving. It was dark. She was alone. She had a child to think about. But something in her chest twisted, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She slowed, pulled over, looked in the rearview mirror. He was still walking, not even looking her way. Rachel didn't know why she rolled the window down, didn't know why she leaned out and called, "Hey, you okay?" The man paused, slowly turned. His face was shadowed by the rain and hood, but even in the dim light she could see the weariness, the distance. "I'm fine," he said. "You don't look fine," she replied. They stared at each other through the storm. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said. His voice was low, hoarse. "I didn't say you were. Do you need a ride?" He hesitated. "I can drop you somewhere near," she added. After a moment, he nodded and limped toward the car. He slid into the passenger seat, water pooling beneath him. The smell of wet fabric and metal filled the space. They didn't speak for several miles. The rain thudded on the roof, the tires hissed against the road. She glanced at him occasionally, noticed the faded army patch, the way he cradled his right side. "You in the service?" she asked. "Was. You got a name?" He looked at her, studied her for a second. "Nate." She nodded. "Rachel." They rode in silence again. She didn't ask where he was going. He didn't offer, but when they reached her street, she didn't stop. She kept driving, a block further, then turned around. "Listen," she said, "I don't have much, but I've got a couch and a dry blanket. You can rest tonight, then move on in the morning." He didn't answer. She pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and turned to him. "I'm not doing this because I'm afraid of you. I'm doing this because you look like you've been forgotten." Still no answer, but he got out. That night, she made tea, gave him a towel, showed him where the couch was. Jalen peeked from his bedroom once, but she waved him back. She didn't sleep well. Part of her feared what she had done. The other part already knew, somehow, that she hadn't made a mistake. In the morning, the couch was empty. The front door closed. A mug sat in the sink, a towel folded neatly on the chair. And next to it, gleaming dully in the pale light, was a Purple Heart. Rachel stood in the kitchen, holding it in her hand, her chest tight, her breath uneven. She didn't understand it, but she felt it. Something had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had barely lifted past the rooftops when Rachel stood at her kitchen sink, staring at the gleam of metal that rested silently beside the drain. The Purple Heart was heavier than it looked, and even though she hadn't picked it up again since that first moment, its presence altered the entire room. It sat there as if it had always belonged, like it had grown out of the silence she'd grown used to living in. She hadn't told anyone about Nate, not her co-workers, not the landlord, not even Jalen, who assumed, in his half-drowsy glimpse the night before, that the quiet man on the couch was one of the tired angels he sometimes dreamed of when his room got too cold. Rachel had no explanation for what she'd done or why. She just knew that something about him, something unsaid and broken, had matched a place inside her that she no longer spoke about either. In the days that followed, she found herself looking for him. Not directly, not obviously, but when she'd pass a bus stop or glance down an alley on her way to work, she'd scan the space like she expected to see his soaked jacket again. Of course, he wasn't there. People like Nate didn't linger. They disappeared, left behind their pain, and kept walking. But his absence became a presence in her life. One more thing she carried alongside the bills and fears and responsibilities that grew heavier by the day. The Purple Heart now lived in the drawer beneath the sink, wrapped in an old dish towel and placed carefully beside a few loose rubber bands, a dead pen, and Jalen's kindergarten drawing of their trailer under a crooked rainbow. Every time she reached for a sponge or trash bag, her fingers would brush near it, and she'd feel something like guilt. Not because she had taken him in, but because she hadn't done more. 12 days passed. The weather grew colder, the air sharper. Rachel worked double shifts when she could, even volunteering to clean the back alley behind the diner just to earn an extra $20. But it was like trying to drain a flood with a teaspoon. No matter how many extra hours she stacked, the bills arrived thicker and more urgent. The electric company left a red notice on her mailbox. Her landlord called again and left a voicemail with the kind of fake concern that barely disguised a threat. And then came the letter she had been dreading most. She found it on a Wednesday morning after dropping Jalen off at school. Folded and crammed between the mailbox and the rusted flag, the envelope was thick and official-looking. The return address confirmed her fears: Maple Hollow County Court, Office of Property Disputes. Rachel didn't open it right away. She carried it inside like it was a weight. She sat down at the kitchen table, stared at the handwriting on the front, her name printed in clean, bureaucratic strokes. It could have been about anything, but she knew better. She tore it open slowly, her fingers stiff, her chest hollow. Inside was a foreclosure notice. Her rent was officially overdue by 68 days. Her landlord had filed to terminate the lease and reclaim the property. 30 days. That's all she had left. 30 days before the house she'd raised her son in, the house her father had once fixed with his bare hands, would be auctioned to strangers. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't scream or slam the table. She simply folded the letter, placed it beside the others in the drawer, and stood there, staring at the pale outline where the paint had peeled above the stove. She thought of Jalen's room, how he had taped stars to the ceiling so he wouldn't be scared at night. She thought of the back garden, where she once tried to grow tomatoes and forgot to water them. She thought of her mother's voice telling her, "You always get back up. You always will." But Rachel wasn't sure that was true anymore. She made it through her shift at the grocery store, barely speaking. At the diner, she smiled and poured coffee, but her movements were slower. She forgot Officer Jim's usual no onions and gave Nora the wrong pie slice. At one point, she wiped the same counter 3 times in a row, staring through the window into the parking lot like someone might appear. Like maybe the man she'd taken in would return and explain what to do next. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after Jalen had gone to sleep. Her hands were folded, knuckles white, eyes unfocused. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. It crawled over her skin, burrowed into her ribs, settled on her shoulders. And then, just past 9 p.m., there was a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just firm. Rachel stiffened. She wasn't expecting anyone. She didn't move right away. Her eyes shot toward Jalen's door, then to the chain on the front door. She moved slowly, silently, barefoot on the floorboards that creaked if you weren't careful. She looked through the peephole and froze. It was him, Nate. But this time he wasn't a soaked silhouette in a storm. He was upright, his face clearer, shaved, his hair trimmed, and his stance strong. He wore a military dress uniform, clean and pressed, with medals she didn't recognize pinned across his chest. He stood tall, not hunched, not broken. Behind him, 2 black SUVs idled quietly. 2 men stood with him, one wearing the insignia of a master sergeant, the other a captain. Rachel opened the door slowly, her voice caught in her throat. "Nate?" He nodded once. "Evening, Rachel." She looked past him, then back at his face. What is this?" He stepped forward, reached into his coat, and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out to her gently. "This is long overdue," he said quietly, "but it's only the beginning." She didn't move. Couldn't. Her hand was still clenched around a dish towel. The taller officer took a step forward. "Miss Thompson, I'm Captain Stephen Marks, United States Army. We're here on behalf of the Office of Veteran Community Engagement and the 5th Special Recon Unit." Rachel blinked. I don't understand." "If now's a good time," the captain said gently, "we'd like to come in and explain." Behind her, Jalen appeared at the hallway entrance, rubbing his eyes. She turned quickly. "Sweetheart, it's okay. Just visitors." The master sergeant crouched slightly and waved. "Hey there, young man." Jalen clutched his bear but didn't speak. Nate looked at him and then at Rachel. "We're real soldiers," he said softly, "but we're not here on a mission. We're here to thank your mom." Jalen's brow furrowed. "Why?" Nate looked at Rachel again. His voice was quieter than before, but unshakably sure. Because when no one else did, she saw someone worth saving. They gathered in the kitchen. The couch still bore the indent from that one rainy night. The table was clean, a bowl of fruit in the center that had been collected from discount bins. The overhead light flickered once but steadied. Jalen returned to his room after a soft promise of dessert later. Rachel sat across from Nate, the unopened envelope resting before her. Nate took a breath. "The night you picked me up, I was in a bad place," he began. His hands were folded, his voice steady but strained. "Worse than I let on. I'd just been discharged from a rehab unit in Harrisburg, not because I was ready, because they were full. Budget cuts." Rachel's hands curled in her lap. "I lost everything in a fire, my wallet, my ID, my proof I was even a soldier. I was walking to Wilton because I thought maybe an old buddy still lived there. I didn't even know if he did." He hesitated. "There was a bottle in my bag. My last one. I planned to find a quiet spot and disappear." Rachel's breath caught. "But then you stopped. You didn't ask what I'd done. You didn't flinch at the scars. You didn't treat me like I was dangerous or broken. You gave me tea, a towel, a couch." He turned slightly toward the captain. "That night, I wrote my unit. Told them something happened, something I didn't understand, something I hadn't felt since before deployment." Captain Marks opened a folder and slid a document toward Rachel. Her name was printed in elegant script beneath the seal of the U.S. Army. Certificate of Community Honor. In recognition of exceptional compassion and quiet service to a wounded veteran. Grace Bennett. No. Rachel Thompson, honorary civilian contributor to veteran resilience and recovery initiatives. Rachel stared at it. Her hands trembled. "That's the Secretary of the Army's signature," the captain said. Sergeant Alvarez placed a second document beside it. Plainer, but even more powerful. "This one," he said. Nate insisted on. Rachel read the first line. "Confirmation of full acquisition and forgiveness of mortgage debt associated with the property at 128 West Elm Street, Richmond, Virginia." Her house, her father's house, saved. She pressed both hands to her face. Her shoulders began to shake. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. Nate looked at her steady. "Because what you did wasn't charity. It was dignity. You gave it without asking. And now, it's come back, the way it should." They didn't stay long, enough to answer her questions, enough to promise follow-up, enough to change her life. Before leaving, Nate reached into his uniform pocket and placed a small velvet box in her hand. Inside was a silver coin. One side bore a military emblem, the other had a single line etched deep. She didn't ask, she just acted. "It's a challenge coin," Nate explained, "usually for valor in combat, but sometimes for civilians who remind us why we serve." Rachel held it against her chest, unable to speak. That night, after Jalen was asleep, she stood in her kitchen again. The Purple Heart rested in the drawer, the certificate on the mantel, the envelope, now empty, beside the sink. Her debt was gone. Her house was safe. But the moment that saved her hadn't started with a solution. It had started with a decision, on a dark road, in a storm, when she chose not to look away. The sky had turned a soft slate gray by the time Rachel woke the next morning. The air outside smelled faintly of wet earth, and the porch light still burned, forgotten from the night before. Her body felt heavier than usual, as if sleep had finally given her a full portion but had charged her interest for it. For the first time in weeks, she hadn't jolted awake at 3 a.m. in a sweat, hadn't checked her phone to see if another bill had posted overnight. Instead, she had slept through, uninterrupted, and for a woman who had lived in tension for so long, that in itself was disorienting. She moved slowly through the house, touching surfaces as if confirming they were still hers. The dent in the kitchen cabinet door, the uneven patch on the living room wall, the loose floorboard in the hallway, Everything was as it had been, but everything felt different. The house hadn't changed. She had. And it was the first morning in years that the home didn't feel like something she might lose. Jalen sat at the table in his pajamas, flipping through a tattered comic book. He looked up and smiled in that easy way he always had. But now Rachel saw it with clearer eyes. How much he trusted her. How much he depended on her, calm even when she had none to give. "Can we have waffles today?" he asked. She laughed, a real one, and ruffled his hair. "I think we can manage that." They ate together with the television on low. Cartoons flickered in the background while Rachel quietly took in the silence, the kind that didn't carry tension. She hadn't told Jalen the full story yet. She didn't know how to put it into words a child would understand. All he knew was that the house was safe, the lights were on, and his mom smiled more. Later that day, Rachel walked into the school cafeteria not as a temp, not as a volunteer, but as a newly hired assistant with an ID badge and a payroll schedule. It wasn't glamorous, hairnets and trays, inventory sheets and early mornings, but it was official, stable, and hers. The head of food services, a brisk woman named Dottie with silver-rimmed glasses and orthopedic shoes, welcomed her with a curt nod and handed her an apron. "We don't do gossip, we don't waste food, and we never serve the meatloaf cold," Dottie said with a half-smile. "Everything else you'll pick up fast." Rachel nodded, slipping on the apron and washing her hands at the industrial sink. The kitchen was loud with clanking trays, the hiss of steamers, and the rhythm of working women moving in sync. She found comfort in the routine, the repetition, the sense of place. No one questioned her here. No one asked if she could afford to be there. She simply belonged. By her second day, she knew where the spatulas were, how to coax the old convection oven to cooperate, and which students needed a little extra on their trays without having to ask. She noticed things, bruises on a child's wrist, a boy who always lingered behind to take leftovers home, a girl who never touched her milk. Rachel didn't speak on it, not yet, but she noticed, because she had lived in those silences. Jalen beamed when he saw her in the cafeteria line. "That's my mom," he told one of his friends. She turned away quickly to hide the tears that sprang too fast. At night, they sat at the table and worked through homework. Jalen showed her a drawing he'd made for a school project, a picture of their house, him, her, and a dog they didn't yet have, standing under a sky with stars. "I said my hero is you," he said matter-of-factly. Rachel pressed a hand to her chest and blinked away the wave of emotion that rose too suddenly. Things were better, but not easy. The scars of fear didn't fade overnight. The memory of the eviction notice, the custody threat, and the sheer fragility of what she had nearly lost lingered just beneath her skin. She still checked the mailbox with hesitation, still slept lightly some nights, still watched Jalen too closely, like she feared someone might snatch him from her if she blinked. Then, 2 weeks before the court date for custody, she received a call from a man named Vincent Dunn. He introduced himself as a legal advisor from a veteran-affiliated pro bono program. Nate, it turned out, had made a few phone calls. "We'd like to represent you in the custody matter," Vincent said. "Free of charge. You've already done enough." Rachel's first instinct was resistance. No one had ever just offered to help without a catch. But Vincent was patient, professional, and thorough. He walked her through the steps, asked for documents, explained her rights and the process in plain language that didn't make her feel small. They met twice in person. Once at a coffee shop where Rachel arrived early and nervously clutched a folder of bills and school letters, and once in her home, where Jalen sat politely at the edge of the couch while they talked. "You're not alone in this anymore," Vincent told her gently. At night, Rachel rehearsed what she might say in court. She looked in the mirror and tried to say things with confidence. "I provide for my son. I'm a stable parent. I am enough." But the words sounded foreign in her mouth, like they belonged to someone braver. The day of the hearing arrived on a bitter cold morning. Rachel wore her best blouse, the one with the small rip under the right sleeve she'd stitched carefully the night before. Jalen waited outside with Nora, who had insisted on coming along for support. Rachel clutched her bag, hands slick with nervous sweat, and walked into the courtroom feeling like she might disappear. Marcus was already there, clean-shaven, in a blazer too nice for someone who'd recently been unemployed, flanked by a smug-looking lawyer with a thin tie and smoother words. They barely acknowledged her. The judge, a stern, older woman with kind eyes beneath her steel, called them forward. Vincent spoke first, calm, controlled. He presented documents, attendance records, letters from the school, testimony from her employer. Rachel watched Marcus's lawyer shift slightly. Then it was her turn. She stood slowly, her legs shaking. Her voice was quiet at first, but steady. "I know I don't have a big house or fancy job," she said, "but my son wakes up every morning knowing he is safe and loved. I pack his lunch, I show up for his school plays, I walk him to the bus when I can. I know how much milk costs and how he likes his sandwich cut." Her voice cracked. She took a breath. "I'm not perfect, but I'm his mother, and I'm doing everything I can with what I have." There was a pause. Even Marcus looked down. When the judge ruled, she didn't drag it out. Her decision was clear, rooted in facts but delivered with compassion. Custody remains with Miss Thompson. The father may apply for supervised visitation, pending further review. Rachel didn't hear anything after the first sentence. Relief crashed over her in waves so strong she nearly sat down again from the weight of it. Vincent squeezed her shoulder. Nora clapped softly from the back. Outside, Jalen ran up and threw his arms around her waist. "We're okay," he whispered. She knelt down and hugged him tightly. "We're okay." They walked home hand in hand. The cold wind stung, but it didn't matter. They were whole. The house greeted them with quiet warmth, and for once the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like arrival. That night, Rachel cooked pasta and let Jalen pick the music. They danced around the kitchen until their feet ached, and when he finally fell asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket, she let herself sit still. Just sit. She looked at the folder of court documents, the coin Nate had given her, the certificate still resting above the mantel. And she thought not of what she had survived, but of who she had become through it. She was not invisible anymore. She was not temporary. She was Rachel Thompson. And she had returned to herself. The days that followed the custody hearing passed with a kind of weightless calm that Rachel had almost forgotten existed. It wasn't that the world around her had changed. Bills still came, the heater still rattled when the temperature dipped too low, and the roof still held its stubborn leak over the back porch. But something fundamental inside her had shifted. She no longer lived in defense. She wasn't bracing for the next blow. She wasn't surviving on instinct alone. She was breathing again, steady and full, as if she had been underwater for years and had finally come up for air. Jalen sensed it too. He smiled more easily, slept more soundly, and stopped asking quietly at night whether they were still staying in this house. There were small changes. a second blanket on his bed, a poster of planets taped to the wall above his pillow, drawings of dogs and dragons now decorating the fridge like it was a real home again. They talked more. Not just about homework or dinner or errands, but about what they dreamed of. Jalen wanted a dog. Rachel, half joking, said she wanted a garden that actually grew something. The job at the school cafeteria had settled into its rhythm. Rachel arrived early, packed cartons of milk, prepped lunch trays, and learned quickly which ovens needed a firm kick and which sinks drained slow. Dottie, the no-nonsense kitchen supervisor, began trusting her with inventory and even called her steady hands on a particularly chaotic Monday. Rachel took the compliment like a warm cup of coffee, quietly, gratefully, holding it in her chest all day. One Thursday afternoon, just as Rachel was wiping down the counters after the lunch rush, a student assistant handed her a plain envelope addressed in neat handwriting. Inside was a short letter with a government seal at the top and a single line that made her stop mid-breath. "We invite you to consider serving as a civilian community advisor for the Veteran Resilience Initiative of Eastern Virginia." Beneath that, a name she recognized in print, signed carefully at the bottom, N. Wells. Rachel read the letter twice before sitting down. She didn't know what a community advisor did. She didn't have military experience or counseling credentials or anything resembling official status. She was a single mother from a neighborhood no one visited unless they had to. She had worked in diners and wiped down supermarket freezers. She had no degrees, no accolades, and no illusion that she had anything to offer a room full of people trained in strength and service. Still, the words wouldn't leave her. That night, she called the number listed in the letter. A woman with a warm voice named Claire explained the program. Veterans and civilians sitting together, sharing stories, offering support, learning from each other in quiet, consistent ways. No speeches, no lectures, just presence. The meetings were held in a converted shipping container outside Wilton, a place where no one needed to be fixed, just witnessed. Rachel didn't say yes right away. She thought about it for 2 nights, laying awake and wondering what it meant to be seen as someone worth listening to. On the 3rd morning, she found the Purple Heart again in the drawer. She held it for a long time. Then she called Claire back and said yes. Her first meeting took place on a chilly Saturday morning. The converted container was humble, with a crooked handmade sign out front that read, "Support Circle, Veterans and Civilians Welcome." Inside, the walls were lined with folding chairs that didn't match, and a coffee pot that hissed like it might explode at any moment. There were 7 people that day. 4 veterans, 1 older woman from town, a young social worker, and Rachel. She didn't speak at first. She listened to stories about deployments and return flights and silences so long they changed the shape of the people inside them. Some people talked about nightmares, others about boredom. One man just sat with his arms folded across his chest the entire hour and left without a word. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was small but even. "I'm not military," she said, "but I know what it's like to go quiet inside, to feel like you're living in a world that forgets you exist unless you shout." No one interrupted. No one nodded either. But one woman, a wiry veteran named Elise, looked her in the eye and gave a small smile. It was enough. She began attending the meetings regularly. She rarely said much, but when she did, it was real. She spoke of her father, a Vietnam veteran who never sat near fireworks, who once built a shed in the backyard just to be alone with the noise he couldn't shake. She talked about raising Jalen on the thinnest thread of hope, about walking to work with holes in her shoes, and about the night she stopped for a stranger in the rain. The others began to notice her in that quiet way people notice trees that survived every storm. One man, Harvey, sat with her outside after a session once. He was old, sun-damaged, with knuckles like tree bark and a voice like gravel. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and finally said, "I used to think civvies didn't get it." Rachel glanced at him. "Some don't." He nodded. "But you didn't need to get it. You just showed up." She didn't respond, just sat with him, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Back in Maple Hollow, the changes in her life began to ripple outward. Nora came by more often now, sometimes with a bottle of wine, sometimes with nothing but a tired joke and a bag of mismatched socks from the thrift store. "You know," she said one Friday, flopping onto Rachel's couch, "our town's quietest celebrity should consider starting a podcast." Rachel laughed. "I barely talk in public." "Exactly," Nora grinned. "That's what would make it brilliant." But behind the teasing were real stories. Nora shared how her brother, a Marine veteran, had recently joined a support group because he heard about a woman in Wilton who spoke without pity. Other people had started asking questions. Strangers came into the bakery where Nora worked and mentioned Rachel by name, quietly, carefully, like passing along the location of a lighthouse. At the school, one of the teachers pulled Rachel aside. "A parent told me what you did, for the soldier, and for your son." Rachel shook her head. "I just showed up." The teacher smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." One afternoon, Rachel set up a small wooden sign at the edge of her garden. It wasn't fancy, just hand-carved letters, slightly uneven but clear. Free produce for any veteran, no questions, no limits. And beneath that, in smaller letters, "If you've served, let the earth serve you now." Some took potatoes. Others took nothing. One young man stood at the edge of the garden for 15 minutes before quietly whispering, "Thank you," and walking away empty-handed, but not empty. Nate visited only a few times, but when he did, he never came alone. He brought others, people like him. One man helped rebuild the rotting fence around the chicken coop. A woman rewired the kitchen's old light fixture. Another fixed the loose latch on the front gate and said nothing, just tipped his cap and left. One of them, a tall man named Reggie, returned a week later without warning and installed solar panels on her roof. "I didn't ask for these," Rachel said, watching from the porch. Reggie shrugged. "Nate said sunlight helps things grow." She stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the panels glinting on the roof like silent armor. That evening, Rachel walked barefoot through the backyard, her toes sinking into the soft soil. Jalen ran ahead, laughing, chasing a kite made from newspaper and string. The air smelled of basil and grass, and the sky stretched wide above them, unbothered and blue. She stood still and let it soak in. The yard was small, the garden still struggled. The coop clucked lazily in the corner, but it was hers. It was theirs. She hadn't won the lottery. She hadn't gone viral. She hadn't been saved by a miracle. What had changed was steadier than all of that. What had changed was her belief that her life, exactly as it was, mattered. That quiet strength was still strength. That being seen without needing to shout was its own kind of power. And now she had a new purpose. Not to fix the world, not to change everything, just to keep showing up, to be the woman who didn't look away, so that others could begin to see themselves again. Winter came early that year, creeping in before the last of the maple leaves had fallen, frosting the rooftops of Maple Hollow in silver silence. The morning air grew thinner, sharper, and Rachel found herself rising earlier just to light the oven and warm the kitchen before Jalen's bare feet touched the cold floor. The solar panels Reggie had installed cut their heating bill nearly in half, but Rachel still moved through each room like someone determined to stretch every ounce of warmth just a little further. Not out of necessity anymore, at least not the desperate kind, but out of habit born from long years of needing to ration even comfort. Life had not become extraordinary. There were still long days and tired feet, still moments when the past curled its fingers around her spine and made her hold her breath. But something deeper had taken root in her days. A sturdiness, a trust in the soil beneath her, in the roof over her head, in the people who now knew her name without suspicion or pity. Her world had not gotten louder, only more real. She kept attending the Veteran Support Circle in Wilton. The folding chairs remained wobbly, the coffee pot still brewed with a rattle, and the hand-painted sign out front had started to fade in the wind. But inside, the voices grew steadier. New people joined, some out of curiosity, others because someone they trusted had told them about the woman who listened like it mattered. Rachel didn't try to be anything she wasn't. She didn't give advice or claim understanding she didn't have. She spoke when she had something true to say, and, in time, that became enough. At the farmer's market, she brought bundles of herbs from her backyard and a basket of potatoes small and crooked but full of flavor. Her stall was simple, with a reused tablecloth and a hand-carved sign that read, "Free for veterans, no questions, no limits." Some stopped to ask about it. Others just took a few carrots or left notes folded under a jar of pickles. One woman, middle-aged with grief stitched into the corners of her mouth, hugged Rachel wordlessly and whispered, "You reminded my son he still mattered," then walked away before Rachel could ask her name. Jalen thrived in this new rhythm. He brought home books from the library and started a compost pile behind the shed. He named the chickens after historical figures and science fiction characters. He asked big questions now, not just, "Are we okay?" but, "What does it mean to help someone for real?" Rachel didn't always have answers, but she never dismissed the questions. Nate came by only occasionally, but each time he arrived he brought someone else. A man who quietly replaced a cracked window pane without charge. A woman who mended the broken fence near the tomato patch. A teenage girl with a sketch pad who painted a mural of flowers on the side of the shed. They never stayed long. They never took anything in return. And Rachel never asked how they found her. She knew better than most that kindness had its own underground network, its own way of circling back without fanfare. One Saturday in December, just after she'd closed up her garden stall for the season, Rachel received a voicemail from the county records office. The clerk, Greg, spoke in a hesitant tone she didn't like. Something about a discrepancy in the property records. Something that needed a follow-up visit. Her stomach tightened. At the office, she sat across from Greg, who looked more uncomfortable than usual. A folder opened between them. "I know the Army paperwork cleared your mortgage," he began, "and that the title was transferred cleanly. But when we scanned the deed again, something came up." Rachel said nothing. "There's an old lien attached to the land, from over 20 years ago, a private loan your father apparently took out after your mother passed. It was never discharged." Her mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" Greg winced. "Technically, they own the acreage behind your home now. The garden, the shed, the coop, everything not directly tied to the original structure." Her world tilted. "But that's our backyard," she said quietly. "That's where Jalen planted sunflowers. That's where—" "I know," Greg interrupted, genuinely pained, "but they filed legally. If you don't contest it, they can fence it off, even sell it." Rachel pressed her hands flat against the table, grounding herself. "Who are they?" He flipped the page. "A shell agency. Purchased the debt last year. They've done this before." Rachel left the office in silence, the folder tucked under her arm like a loaded weapon. In her truck, she sat still for nearly 10 minutes, her fingers locked around the steering wheel. She'd fought too hard, come too far. She wouldn't lose this now, not again. She pulled out her phone. "Hi, Nate. I know you've already done more than I could ever ask, but something's come up." She hit send, then whispered to the empty truck, "Please, let kindness keep going." Nate didn't ask for details. He called the next morning. His voice was calm, familiar. "Tell me everything." She did, slowly, measured. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, there was silence. "I'll take care of it," he said. 3 days later, a man in a charcoal suit with polished shoes and a quiet authority walked into the county records office. He carried a leather briefcase, a federal ID, and a stack of documents stamped with an official seal. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply handed Greg a packet signed by a judge from the Eastern District. The lien was invalid. The loan had been reactivated through fraudulent means. The agency behind it was now under federal investigation. It was over. This time, for real. When Greg called Rachel with the update, she didn't answer at first. She just stared at the screen, heart thudding. Then, she climbed into her truck and drove to the edge of town. There, at the top of the hill where her father once taught her how to start a stalled engine, she parked and let herself cry. Not soft, silent tears, but big, messy sobs that shook through her shoulders and left her gasping. No one watched. That was the point. Later that evening, she called Nate. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "You already did," he replied. "You just don't know it yet." The next day, she found another envelope in her mailbox. No return address, no stamp. Inside was a single card, handwritten in the same careful block letters she recognized. "What you grow in quiet places will one day feed someone you'll never meet." Beneath it, a single word in the slanted script, "Seer." Latin, she would later learn, for always. Rachel folded the note gently and placed it beside the purple heart, the silver coin, and Nate's original letter. A small wooden box now held them all, not as trophies, but as reminders. Of storms weathered, of doors opened, of the kind of courage that doesn't shout. That weekend, she stood barefoot in her backyard, the spring sun warming the soil. It was hers now, all of it. The house, the earth, the clucking coop, the space where Jalen had once buried a peanut in a plastic cup and called it an experiment. The roots she once feared would be ripped away had grown deeper, stronger. A new sign appeared at the edge of the garden, painted by hand. The words slightly uneven, but proud. Free produce for any veteran. No questions, no limits. And beneath it, smaller, steady, "What you grow in quiet places will one day feed someone you'll never meet." They came. Not always for the food, not just for the tomatoes or beans or eggs. They came for the look in her eyes that said, "I see you." For the quiet welcome of being remembered without having to explain. On her birthday that spring, a package arrived with no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a framed photograph. Nate, standing at a podium in Washington, D.C., hand over his heart. Behind him, projected onto a massive screen, the words, "She didn't ask. She just acted, and beneath it, in bold letters, Rachel Thompson. She hung it beside the pantry, near the shelf where she packed meals every night. Not as decoration, but as memory, as truth. Some things, she had learned, didn't need to be carved in marble to matter. They lived in the hands that kept giving, in the doors that stayed open, in the quiet strength of someone who chose again and again to show up. If someone ever asked her whether kindness mattered, she'd know exactly how to answer. Because once she had stopped on a rainy road, and nothing had ever been the same again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to discover another powerful journey, and share this one with someone who needs to believe in kindness again.